What's up guys, it's Seasalt here and welcome back to the channel. Today is a very special day. I'm joined today by TK, a good friend of mine who has been playing KARUTA for a while. He has been an active player in the KARUTA community for a while now and has extensive experience both with doing mystic dye jobs as well as valuing different dyes. Feel free to introduce yourself, man.
Hey everyone, my name's TK, and like Seasalt said, I've been playing KARUTA for quite a while now. Mainly I'm active in the dye community and I spend a lot of my time in KARUTA doing dye jobs. You probably see my advertisements in various servers, so if you ever want to get your cards dyed, feel free to hit me up. Thanks for having me here today.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, it's great to have you as well. It's crazy to me because I thought, honestly, I've been playing a long time, but I've only started in the beginning of this year, so almost a year now, 10 months. It's just crazy to think how long you've been at it. But I guess how I want to structure this video is more of a tutorial and guide for players that don't really know what the dye economy is about, you know, what mystic dye jobs are, and all that. So I guess the way I want to structure it is one, just walking through how you get mystic dye, and then two, kind of explaining how the mystic dye job economy works, right? There's so much that goes into, you know, influencing prices, whether it be renting a good color, bad color, or purchasing or selling a mystic dye. So I'm wanting to learn more about that. And finally, just looking at how you look at valuing mystics and how the mystic market looks like at the current moment for you. Does that work?
No, yeah, that sounds good. I'll try to provide my best insight on each of these topics, and hopefully we can all leave this video learning something new.
Yeah, just get starting with the first section. I know that I've personally already explained it in my dye video that I've released, which gives a basic rundown on all this, but if you haven't watched it yet, I'll link it above. But do you just want to give maybe a 30-second or so spiel on how you acquire mystic dyes in the game?
Yeah, so in KARUTA, there's an item you can buy called a dye. So if I just do a demonstration right here, you can buy a dye for 50 gems right here, and you can open it in order to receive a dye with a random color and name right here. And unfortunately, it's not a mystic dye, but when you do open a dye, there's a 1% chance that it will drop as a mystic variant. What that means is that it will have a glow with random intensity. And for a lot of you who are familiar with the gacha system, that's essentially what it is, because it's purely just RNG, because there's no cheat codes, there's no strategy in opening it. You're simply just opening a dye and hoping that you can get a mystic. So one thing I want to point out that people might not be familiar with is that just because two dyes have the same name doesn't necessarily mean they're going to have the exact same color or glow intensity. So let me show you an example really quick. So right here, you see these two dyes named Mystic Jellyfish, but you can see that these two dyes, despite having the exact same name, they actually have different kind of shades as well as different glow intensities. A good rule of thumb to really just take note of is, even though they have similar names, you want to assess each dye differently because they're always going to have different glows and color.
A question that a lot of people in my server usually ask, you know, and that question is, if I've opened up a mystic, should I sell it or should I keep it? How much should I sell it for? And should I just start doing dye jobs with it? And my question is, I guess, if you're going for the latter, TK, what are some things that, you know, people should consider as newer people beginning their journey, as maybe people are doing dye jobs or people just renting mystics and all that? Because really anyone can really rent normals. Like, it's really easy to rent normals, but I feel like renting mystics is a bit different. Can you just expand a little bit more on that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of factors that different people have when they want to consider being a dye jobber or not. To start off, if you ever get a new dye that's a mystic and you're, like Seasalt said, you don't know what to do with it, you should consider not the dye itself, but just the commitment there is, right? If you want to rent dyes, then sure, having any mystic dye is a good start. But if you don't want to go through kind of the trouble and hassle of being a dye renter, you know, talking to people all the time, because it is a lot of interaction with people that some people not be comfortable with, you can go ahead and sell the dye itself, right? Because not only do you skip the process of having to talk to people, but you also make an immediate profit without having to do any extra effort. So in the end of the day, it's easier to sell a dye outright to make a quick profit, but there's also the different route you could take, as Seasalt said, if you want to become a dye jobber. So renting dyes does take a level of commitment from the person, as well as an interest in collecting dyes themselves. I would think of it synonymous to collecting cards, in my opinion. You know, some people like collecting a certain series or a certain waifu that they really like. Conversely, people do like to collect dyes, such as myself. And it really makes sense that if you're going to have a lot of mystic dyes, you can rent those dyes to other people and share with them. The difference between selling a dye and renting it would mainly be the profits you're making, as well as the level of commitment you have. In terms of profits, when you sell a dye, you're making an immediate amount of money that you get for trading the dye away, right? When you're doing a dye rental, you're more so having a trickle down profit where each dye rental slowly nets you a small amount of money. So if you compare both selling and renting a dye, you can see that if you just sell a dye right away, you can make astronomically more money than renting it. But on the flip side, if you are renting dyes, you get to keep the dye. You're not technically losing anything because the person who wants to rent your dye will generally pay for the service as well as a convenience fee. So that's strictly profits without losing anything, including the dye itself.
Thanks for that so far. Do you have any, like, I guess, tips for newer dyers?
So there's a lot of things that you have to take into account, but I would say some of the most important things is to be very proactive and tenacious, right? Because when you start off as a new dye renter, no one will know who you are, and being trustworthy is an extremely important factor if you want to rent dyes, because I'm pretty sure a lot of you have heard stories of people having their cards stolen from renters, especially if you have very valuable cards like low prints or high wishlist cards. So customers are very cautious who they want to rent dyes from. But that doesn't mean you should give up, right? You shouldn't be picky about what kind of people are renting from you. And, any order is a good order because it helps build your reputation as a dye renter. I think the most important part really is just slowly building a name and a brand for yourself. You want to show people that you're committed to dye renting. And if you are, and you also build up your collection over time, people will start coming back to you to have their cards dyed. If you have some good service, if people remember who you are, they'll come back to you in the future or also refer some of their friends to you. When I first got started, there was a lot of occasions where when I first had customers, they would also invite their friends to come get their cards dyed. I was really grateful that those kind of people referred to me to have their cards dyed and help build my branding and reputation as a person in the dye community. You can also advertise in servers with dedicated dye services. You can also advertise there and put out your dye orders and your prices and your collection so that people can see that, hey, he's a dye renter who wants to share his dyes with the world. You can also do it in Seasalt server, who is also a very dedicated dye server with an outstanding collection of dye renters like Seasalt himself.
Let's just get into the meat of a video now, TK, which is how do you value mystic dyes, right? Like, so from my experience, right, 50% of the dyes in the market are decently subjective in value. These are your mid-tier, glows and colors. I'm talking about like a mid-tier pink or a mid-tier light blue, mid-tier green, whatever. They might trade at like at most plus or minus 500 gems. I feel like a regular dye valuer, like there's no way someone will give that mystic a value within a over that plus or minus 500 range. These are your, classic mid-tier dyes that you might own as a, decent beginner dye renter. The other 30% I think is pretty objective. They pretty much sell at plus or minus like 150 gems or so. These are your no glow blues, no glow pinks, no glow purples, no greens, nasty colors, your multicolors, right? Everyone knows what they sell for, like 200 gems uncharged, like 800 gems charged or whatever. Those are like plus or minus 100 gems or so. The last 20% of mystic dyes on the market are those that you'll never have to replace because it's the top of the color in the game. And you and I know, TK, right? If we say like, okay, who has the best black in the game? Like we know who that is, which dye it is. These are the top of the color in the games. These are usually sold via auctions, especially in Pluffy's market. And they can range from 20k gems to over 250k gems or like even like more than that, right? So, I mean, if it's objectively the best one of that color in the game, supply is only one, demand can be infinite. And if there's a bidding more, then it can, raise that value a lot. So,
exactly.
TK, you're more experienced than me in the Mystic games. So how would you kind of approach valuing Mystics in general?
Yeah, so a really good premise you gave. And let me first say that everything I'm about to share is my own opinion, and it's no means a representation of how the whole dye community feels. Everyone has their own opinions as to how dye should be valued, just like cards. And at the end of the day, it's very subjective. I know that you said like maybe 50% is subjective, 30% objective, and 20% skyrockets. But honestly, being in the community for so long, any dye can really be the make or break for someone's career. It's either the best dye they'll be holding on for forever, or they'll be selling it within 2 weeks. For me, there are different variables I consider when I value dyes. At surface level, I can break it down into 3 different categories, which is the glow, the color, and how the dye looks visually. So the glow of the dye is objectively the most important variable to consider when you price a dye. To put it very simply, if a dye has no glow at all, people are probably not going to buy it, because what's the point of having a mystic dye if there's no glow? It might as well just be a normal dye, right? Like you said, Seasalt, these dyes, if you try to sell them, will be the ones that net you the lowest profits. So to just give a really quick comparison, I would say Delightful Peach right here and compare it to Glazed Sugar. Seasalt and the audience, if you see these two dyes as a seller or potential renter, which dye would you be more inclined to keep? and which dye would you want to sell? You know, you see Delightful Peach, it has a really nice glow and color versus Glazed Sugar. You're going to tell yourself, okay, Delightful Peach definitely stands out more, so I might as well just get rid of Glazed Sugar because the glow and the color isn't as outstanding as it. So as for the color, this is more of a premise that's set within the dye community itself, and that basically determines how valuable the base color of a dye is compared to other colors. A lot of this ranking mainly has to do with how common a color is when you open a Mystic dye. You probably all have opened countless numbers of green Mystic dyes, opening dyes, but you've never really gotten a red or black one, and even if you did, they don't really come out as astounding as the really good ones you see. So generally speaking, I think this is my hierarchy of how valuable I'd rank the colors. But again, this is by no means how you should rank them if you ever want to sell them. It's more like a baseline idea of, you know, if I get a Mystic dye and I'm confused, how much could I get an idea of selling this for? So green dyes, I would say, and Seasalt also said, are probably the least popular colors. They're not going to be that expensive, and the reason being this is that not only do you open countless amount of green dyes when you open a Mystic, but there's just not that many cards out there that can work with a green Mystic dye. You know, red dyes are more popular because a lot of anime waifus have red colored eyes. You don't really see anime waifus with green colored eyes, so you know, generally speaking, you're not going to get that much rental on it, and because of that, the price on these green dyes aren't going to be outstanding. I would also clump purples in the same category. Purples, they're nice and all, but a lot of purples that get opened don't have really good glows. When you see a lot of dyes for sale, you can see a lot of purple and sometimes pink dyes that don't have really good glows or colors, and they're very common. Like, how often do you think that you see the same dye for sale, but in reality it's just a different name dye, but a same shade that you've seen like a day or two before?
Yep, I agree. Yeah, there's always these like really bad purples, and like, you kind of almost become like blind to it, or like you just don't notice anymore when you scroll through like selling dye channels. It's just the same glow purple, same shade.
Exactly. So because of that, people always open these kind of dyes, and like I said, these are your really common dyes that just by however the dye system is, you know, configured, these are the most common colors, and because of that, they sell for cheaper because no one wants to keep them. So moving on, I know people don't want to hear about the cheap dyes, so let's move on to the more expensive stuff now. But these colors will be your red dyes. So red, like I just mentioned, are kind of the colors that define a lot of characters in anime. You know, a lot of popular characters like Kaguya, Ria's Gremory, they all have red colors in their artwork. So these colors will definitely be more popular, on top of the fact that they are more rare to roll when you open a Mystic dye. You know, like I've mentioned, it's very hard to get a Mystic red when you open a dye versus a green or purple. So these dyes are generally your more valuable dyes that will have a bigger baseline price tag compared to a green. Other colors that follow under this category are your whites and blacks. So white dyes, they're a little more subjective because if you haven't seen a lot of Mystic dyes, you might be confused as to what constitutes a white dye. You know, if you see my collection of white dyes, when I filter it, obviously some of these are not white and some of these are, but you still want to test each white dye you get to see if it is truly white, because some of them might not appear as white when you try it out. But if they do look really good, they have a nice white color and consistency across a frame, which I'll dive into later, these can sell for very high prices. And then lastly, there are your black dyes right here. They also are one of the more coveted colors. The only difference between red, white, and black dyes is that because black can only come in so many shades, right? There's only one true black color you can get, as you can see in Mystic Wire Wool right here. Like, this is honestly as black as I could possibly find for myself. So you can't really find as good blacks as you could reds or whites, but once you find that one black, you know that's going to be the one, because it's really hard to upgrade a black and get it darker than it possibly could. And because of that, people really want to min-max what kind of blacks they get and try to find as close to a pure black as they can. So if you want to compare them to like some other dark colors I have, you can see Breaker Bray and Swandry. These are kind of your black colors, but they're not the traditional pure black that you see in the color wheel. And because of that, people will definitely shell a lot more money to get as close to a black as they can. People do like to sell blacks for extremely high prices because there is a demand, like I mentioned, to get as close to black as possible, because people like me, I get very picky about what shades I have, and if it's not the blackest I can get, then I don't really want to keep it. Imagine I didn't have Wire Wool and I only had I think Breaker Bay was actually one of my first alleged black colors. You know, it's black, but you can see kind of the blue tints on it, and for someone like me, I would honestly want to try to find an even better black, and I don't mind paying the extra mile to get a black that I can settle with. But luckily for my case, I was able to open a really decent black that stuck around me for a long time already. That'll probably keep until, if there's actually a better black out there, I will have to pay an arm and a leg for it. But
Nice.
yeah. And then in between the red, white, blacks, and the greens are kind of your mid-tier colors, like Seasalt said. These colors are more subjective because these colors can range from a lot of different shades and glows that might not be easy to determine. So to give an example really quick, if you remember Delightful Peach that I just brought up, this is more like a yellow beige color. It's one of the most expensive dyes I bought, honestly. And like Seasalt said, these are very subjective, right? Like, it's not your end game color, it's not a white, black, or red, but it's a color that really stands out because of the glow, how it looks. A lot of people like pastel colors, and including myself. So to pay a lot for this dye has made me, kind of rethink my life choices. But at the same time, it's one of those end game dyes that I really want to keep for a long time because I don't think I can get any better than this. And it's these kind of dyes that are in the middle where people think, oh, should I sell them for a lot or should I sell them for cheaper? I would say it really just depends in this little middle category of colors, which is why I'm saying, just because I'm giving you a hierarchy of different colors, you should always try to assess whether or not a dye is good just by how it looks. Conversely, we have orange dyes. Orange also are very mid-tier colors, but orange could range from a variety of different shades. You have Cape Jasmine right here, which is more of a dark orange, versus Mystic Cheese, which is a more brighter orange. And to me, these two different oranges can range from, say, like Cape Jasmine. I don't know how much I bought this for, but I would say it's about 4,000 gems. Mystic Cheese, I remember I bought this for 10,000 gems. So it really just depends in that little middle area of how it looks. So this is just a simple classification of how different colors are ranked. Like I said, this is just a baseline idea, but it really just boils down to how a dye looks as a whole, which brings up to my final point, which is how dyes look visually. I can give you a premise as to how to get an idea of what a dye price is, the glow, the color, if it's a really base generic color like green or red, and if the glow is spectacular, you can sell it for a lot more than a glowless dye. But it really just comes down to how a dye looks for each individual card. This factor is very subjective, and it really differs between each person depending on whoever you ask. This isn't simply just how this little preview is, this little card corner of the dye, but it also depends on how the dye looks on frames and characters. For me, I like to find dyes that look very clean when you test them on frames, as well as match popular cards. If you remember what I said, people love to match colors with their favorite waifus, and a lot of different colors can be fit for different use cases depending on the card and frame. So I want to give some examples right here because it's not easy to give you a demonstration of how a dye looks just by looking at the preview. I think it's better to see how it looks in practice. A lot of different dyes have different effects on frames, but you also want to assess that would the dye be good on popular frames, because they don't want to dye a card with the fuselage frame, right? Like, there's this frame right here. I swear I've never seen anyone use this frame, but you don't want to test your dyes on this frame. You want to use more popular frames like Cherry Blossom, Shadow Glass. A lot of the new frames that Seasalt brought up in his previous video are very good. They're very beautiful, and you should definitely try your dyes on those frames. So some examples I want to give right now. I have this color right here. It looks good, right? But you're probably thinking, compared to a white, black, or red, is it really that outstanding? And to me, I like to assess that this dye would work really good on a lot of popular cards. Mainly it works really well on Gojo Satoru. So if I test it right here, as you can see, it's not a perfect fit, but just from looking at it face value, it really matches his art style there's some orange peach tints, a little bit of pink, but it's not a perfect match, but it's something I would ask myself and tell myself, hey, if it can match a popular card, then this dye is more valuable than how it looks face value. And just a little side thing, I really like using Rainbow Galaxy frame to test colors because not only is it very popular, granted it is a premium frame, but it does a really good job expressing colors that a dye has. This corner doesn't really do justice as to how a frame will display a color, so I think Rainbow Galaxy does a really good job highlighting the colors on a dye. So another example of, comparing the visual preview of a dye to how it actually looks on a frame, I can show you this dye right here. This dye is actually one of my go-to colors when people ask for a light pseudo white color, but you probably see this dye right here and it's not white, it's clearly blue, but it has a little purple on it. And people usually don't use this dye when they want to test colors. Whenever I get a dye order asking for whites, they rarely include this dye in their order, despite me thinking that, this is one of my favorite white dyes. And usually I have to recommend people to try this dye out. And I'll give you some examples to show why, this is one of my favorite white dyes. And you shouldn't always take everything for face value and try out the dyes to see how valuable they can actually appear to be. So if we're going to be using the same Gojo card right here, you can see that in practice, this does have a really nice white pastel color. It doesn't really do it justice that it looks like this, and then it can end up like this on Rainbow Galaxy. Like I said, Rainbow Galaxy. And using the same dye, I'll show you how it can also appear as very white that a lot of people might not know from face value. So this is the same dye on this card, and as you can see, it is actually very white on this frame. So you shouldn't discredit a dye just because of how it looks in the preview. You should try it out, and it'll appear white on some frames, which is why I value this dye very much. And just as a last example, using the same dye, you can see that on this frame, it is purely white. It is the exact same dye that I previewed earlier, but it appears as pure white on this frame. So always try out different dyes on different frames to make sure that you can truly understand how it looks on frames and if there's added value to it. Now, because of that, I also want to highlight that some dyes, even though they look good, it can hold true that they don't look good on frames. So to give a quick example right here, we have this orange color, Aerospace Orange. It's a very solid orange color. The glow is pretty good for what it is. But one thing I want to highlight is that it has this little green edge right here, this little limey color. As someone who wants to have a really good orange dye, you can look at this dye and be like, okay, it's a solid orange, but I'm kind of afraid if that little lime color will ruin a frame. I hate to break it to you, but those little blemishes that you see on a dye can really affect how it looks, and because of that, lower the value of a dye, because when you test it, it doesn't look as good as how the preview is. If you check out the same orange on the Gojo, you see, okay, it's a nice orange. The glow is pretty, orangey. As a renter or someone who wants to get their card dye, I look at this orange and will be like, oh, I don't really like that green glare. And because of that, this dye now appears less favorable than the preview is. And the value of it will definitely drop because of that. And another example, here's a cherry blossom frame right here. You can see that right here on this little corner, you can see that green imperfection right there. And because of that, you're going to ask yourself, wow, should I even bother keeping this orange dye and sell it for a lot? Because it doesn't really work well on these popular frames that people will probably ask me to dye. So when you see this, you'll realize, it's not as good as a color as another color that might be more consistent across the preview. A Mystic Spoiled Egg, like I showed earlier. You can see that it doesn't really have any outline colors or inverse colors that make it stand out to be bad. So if we try this dye on the same frame I just have, if you compare it, you can see it doesn't really have that underlying edge color compared to Aerospace Orange. It's more consistent across the frame, and because of that, people will be more inclined to rent this color because it looks cleaner and more consistent, and the color is pretty nice. So with the example of Aerospace Orange that I gave you, you might think, okay, because these colors have a lot of imperfections, they're probably not valuable and I should just get rid of them, just because it's not a pure orange. But that doesn't mean you should discredit the value of every dye that kind of falls under the same category of having little imperfections or outline colors. So I want to dive into this topic of the more unusual dyes like Aerospace Orange, which people jokingly call the cursed dyes in the community, and how some of these cursed dyes can be fairly valuable despite looking really unusual in the preview. So one of my favorite colors that I have right now is actually this one right here, Jinza Momi Pink. You tell yourself it's blue and orange. Yeah, right? Like, it's one of those grossly complementary colors you can have on a dye, and why would anyone want to rent it? But you'd be surprised, like just last week alone, I got 5 rents on this dye, and I was keeping count because I was telling myself, wow, this dye is so weird. Why is everyone renting it? And the truth is, just because a dye looks strange from the preview doesn't mean it's not valuable. There is a lot of people out there who want to make really interesting combinations with different dyes and frames, and colors like these, you should really try to play around with and see if there's any value in testing these. So let me show you some examples with this dye and show you that an unusually cursed dye, as people say, can actually wound up being very valuable to the extent that people will actually want to rent it. The baseline example with Gojo, you can see this kind of falls under what I talked about earlier. The dye does not look that aesthetically pleasing, but that doesn't mean you should think it's not valuable. You should try some other frames with it. For example, you can see that with the exact same color that I had, it actually creates this really cool kind of orange-blue gradient. So just because it doesn't work with one frame, you should try it out with others. And this is actually one of the more popular frames that I've dyed it with. Lastly, I want to showcase this one. So this was actually a combination I found out very recently when someone asked to test it with this frame. I don't know what I was getting myself into. They just asked me, hey, can you try this dye with the dye order? When I tried it, I was actually dumbfounded at how cool this looked. It really shows like, you know, some dyes might not look good on some frames. In the future, they might release some frames that really highlight and express dyes in ways that normal contemporary dyes can't fulfill. You have this really cool orange blue gradient that you can't really get out of other dyes, and that's solely because this dye just appears as it is in the preview, you know? Just going back to the original point, you shouldn't discredit a dye just by how it looks. You should always try to play around with it, and if it looks cool on some frames, you know, some people will think the same thing and want to rent it, or they want to buy it off you for a really high price. And lastly, I just want to do like one more cursed dye to showcase. This dye actually got an offer of 20K, I believe, in an auction. After you test it on some frames, maybe that draws more interest on people, and that's why they bid it so high. The one frame that I really liked how this dye looked on Black Tiara on my Eula, like you can see that this dye right there creates this really interesting rainbow effect on these little diamonds, and the glow just matches the Eula background perfectly. You really have to see what kind of use cases each dye can fall under, and if it really has a good use case like this, people will pay more for it. And just to round it out, you know, I've been saying all this talk about increase in added value. There's no real number you can give when you say this is more valuable than another dye, because it's all just kind of subjective. Because someone sees this dye on this frame, they're gonna say, oh, I'm just gonna add 3,000 more gems to it. In reality, that's not how it works. A dye is only as valuable as someone wants to pay for it. Granted, I gave those little baseline ideas of the color as well as the glow. Those are just general ideas of how much you could spend for it. But when you have these really unusual edge cases where a dye is very unique, unlike the others, and you're just confused as to how much it can be really worth, it just depends on how much someone's willing to spend on it, right? If someone wants to spend 20K on Turquoise Sea, they will do it, but it by no means says that's how much the value of the dye is. You know, one day this can be 20K, but on a bad day, someone will only want to spend 5K on this. So it's purely subjective, and I think to really get a good idea of it is to just test your dyes on different frames. If you can show people, like, if you want to put a 40K price tag on Turquoise Sea, you should tell people and show them why you want to put a 40K price tag on it. Dyes like these, you really want to just play around with it on different frames. If there's a buyer who wants to buy it for the price, then that's lucky you. You know, you really landed the jackpot on that one.
Great. Yeah, no, that's super helpful. I think like you put it perfectly. Like dyes itself are very, very subjective. It's not like cards where like a print number defines the price and like a wish list number defines the price. Like for dyes, there is a wish list of dyes. There is no print number for dyes. Literally the only thing the dye gives you is the glow and the color and what you said visually, how it looks. So yeah, great job. I think it's really helpful. Cool. Yeah, so thank you so much, TK. I think people find this really helpful. It gives a good baseline to how, you know, people can get into renting and how much physics can be priced. So appreciate the time. Good luck with everything.
No, yeah, thanks for having me here, and I hope, you know, everyone came out of this learning something new. And if you have any questions, you can DM Seasalt and he will tell you what I've taught. I'm always happy to chat, you know. And yeah, thanks again for having me, you know. And for everyone being here, I hope I was as helpful as and informative as I could be. And, you know, thanks again.
Yep, thank you. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks. Bye.